Mr. Lewis, thank you so much for being here today. As Mr. McGee mentioned, you have 3 Grammy Awards, 7 gold records. To your credit, you've received several honorary doctorate degrees. In addition to that, you've performed at the White House and played with over 25 symphony orchestras across the world. You grew up in the housing projects in Chicago, Cabrini Housing Projects. Your initial musical training was in classical music, and at age 9, you were chosen to play for the gospel chorus in your church. How do these musical influences impact your growth as a young man and as a young musician?
Repeat the last 2 sentences, please.
How did the musical influences from your early life impact your growth as a young musician and a young man?
Well, how did it impact my musical growth as a young man, playing in church and studying classical music? I didn't realize at the time that it was. I was too busy learning or too busy practicing or playing baseball and other things. It wasn't until later years, I think the first time I began to be curious about my style, I must have been in my early 20s, after we released our first album, Ramsey, Lewis, and the Gentlemen of Swing. And someone stopped me on the street and said, "Did you make a record?" I said, "Yeah, we did." He said, "I thought it was you. They didn't name the person or the song, but it sounded like you. I've heard you a lot in person." And I thought that was so unique and unusual at the time, 21, 22 years old, that someone could recognize your musical personality. But that didn't inspire me to dig deeper into, well, what is my musical personality? Years after that, I was playing a jazz festival in Hawaii opposite the great Dizzy Gillespie, and I overheard an interview he was doing, and I don't know what they asked. Oh, fusion music, the category. That's another subject about categories. And they asked him, what did he think about fusion? And he said, well, jazz has always been fusion. Jazz has always absorbed that music of that period or that era that it was played. And he said, well, this man over here, and he pointed to me standing over there, he plays fusion music. Do you hear the gospel in his playing? Do you hear the classical in his playing? That made me think a little deeper about my musical personality. And later on, I read an interview that Maurice White did in London, and they asked him about his earlier travels, and he said he had performed with my group, and they questioned him further, and he also said, well, you know, Ramsey's roots are in gospel and classical music. So I must have been surely in my 30s or near 40 before I started really looking at where my influences were. Because as I listened to those records and as I listened to some performances, I said, that doesn't sound... Now, we do play a gospel medley, which you're going to hear later, but this piece, that's not gospel. This piece, that's not classical, but now I know what they mean. And I think that's what a jazz musician is all about. A jazz musician is about absorbing his musical or her musical experiences as well as life's experiences. And some of them you can recall consciously, and some of them come out in other ways. Some of them come out creatively, and you don't know, where did that come from? Well, we all have that storehouse, don't we? We all have that storehouse that we can connect to, and then there's a storehouse that we can't intentionally connect to, but it's there. Once we get to know ourselves and become free in our thinking, know ourselves, that's a powerful, those 2 powerful words. They appear in the Bible, know thyself, in all the philosophers. Once we begin to come to terms with who we are, sometimes that secret wealth of ideas will open up and send things to you, and you'll say, I didn't think of that. Where did that come from? Did I answer your question?